Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I was just going over my dive gear, making sure everything works properly. Before I ever go on any trip, I always make sure everything is in good order. You never want to go somewhere to realize that something is wrong with your dive gear, because then you might have to rent something and you might not even be able to find anything to rent for that matter. That's why I always bring my own dive gear and I make sure everything has been serviced properly. Alright, so it seems like everything is looking good and we're ready to go on our trip to Canada. Now we're going to be diving in Lake Ontario and leaving out of the port in Kingston. We're going to be diving on two wrecks. The first wreck is called the Comet, which is a paddle-wheeled steamboat that was sunk in the late 1800s. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that ship once we get to the site. We'll also be diving on another ship called the George A. Marsh, which has a fascinating story and a very tragic one at that, unfortunately. So we'll be talking a whole lot more about that once we get out there. And I really look forward to seeing you in the water, so we'll see you down below.
Hello everyone, here we are in Kingston, Canada, getting ready to start our dive to search for the Comet. The Comet was a twin-engine side-wheeled steamer which was built in Ontario in 1848 and registered at Kingston. It was 174 feet long, 23 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. The Comet was fitted with 1835 beam engines from an older steamer. She was a passenger ship. The Comet also hauled freight on the St. Lawrence River and in Lake Ontario. In 1851, the boiler exploded on the Comet, and the Comet received heavy damage. After the ship was repaired, it was renamed the Mayflower. However, in 1858, it was renamed once again back to the Comet. Tragically, on May 14, 1861, she was making her route from Kingston to Toronto, when all of a sudden she collided with an American schooner named the Exchange. Through the impact, the Comet lost power from its steam engines. The captain tried to use the ship's rudder and the current to bring the Comet closer to shore. But the ship could not make it. The Comet began to sink faster and faster. 2 of the crewmen died. However, through the brave actions of the captain and its crew, all of the passengers survived. As I descend down onto the Comet, I notice its debris field as the ship began to break apart and sink to find its final resting place. As I swim closer to the wreck, I notice off in the distance the large formation of one of its paddle wheels. A beautiful sight. As I proceed even closer, I notice all the zebra mussels that have found their way onto the ship's hull. Zebra mussels themselves do not destroy the ship. They get their food from organisms and other particles floating in the water. This resulted in the improving of the visibility in Lake Ontario's water. Unfortunately, the zebra mussels population is growing very quickly, adding a lot of weight to the old wooden ships, causing the wood to break apart and collapse. As I slowly swim to the midship of the Comet, I notice something sticking up in the distance. It seems to be what's left of one of the smokestacks. As I look down into the smokestack, I notice that the steam engine itself is buried too deep in the sediment for me to examine. But as I look up, I look across the ship and I notice that the other smokestack is also still standing. So I begin to swim over to investigate. Oh, what do we have here? It looks like one of the hatches that led to one of the storage areas below deck. As I look in between the wood planks, I begin to notice that it looks like the lower decks of the ship have collapsed. When I look at the front of the ship, it appears when the boat sank that it went down head first, so the front of the ship slammed into the bottom of Lake Ontario and suffered severe damage through the impact. Here we have one of the gears that used to help raise and lower the anchor of the Comet. As I continue to swim down the main deck of the Comet, I notice a large hatch that survived the impact with the American ship. When I look around the deck, I begin to imagine how chaotic things were as the two ships collided into each other. You can almost hear the crew shouting orders trying to save the passengers' lives. As I make my way around the Comet, I notice the damage to the ship from the impact with the American schooner. It must have been terrifying for the people on board as they were thrown off their feet and fell hard onto the deck of the Comet because of the collision. It must have been an awesome sight to see this ship when it was still afloat carrying its passengers as these large paddle wheels helped steam the engine through Lake Ontario. It will never cease to amaze me how the cold, frigid waters of the Great Lakes can preserve these 100-plus-year-old ships from degrading into dust and memory. Well, our time is up on the Comet. It's time for us to make a nice, safe, slow ascent and do our safety stop before we proceed on to our next ship, the George A. Marsh. The date was August 8, 1917. The George A. Marsh was going to carry a load of coal for Rockwood Hospital in Kingston. The Sowards Coal Company hired the Marsh for the job because its usual ship was busy at the time. The Marsh rarely made the trip to Kingston. However, it had been getting harder and harder for the Marsh to find a job because the old wooden schooners were being replaced with newer steamships. So the captain jumped at a chance to earn a little extra money. It was going to carry 450 tons of coal from New York to Kingston. The captain's name was John Wesley Smith. However, the captain could not go on this trip. Unfortunately, he did send his wife with their 5 children and his brother, William Smith. As I approach the ship, I can only imagine how valiantly the crew fought to save their lives, as well as the lives of their wives and children. Let's continue the tale of that fate-filled day. The Marsh left from New York with a load of coal and was sailing to Kingston. The crew found themselves in a large storm. The waves began to get bigger and bigger. As the waves slammed into the side of the Marsh with greater and greater force, the ship's timbers began to break apart. The crew worked hard and fast to try to get giant C-clamps to hold the timbers together. Finally, the marsh could take no more. A large wave came to deal its final blow. The ship's side opened up and water started to rush in. The people on board could look out the side and see Kingston in their sights, but there was no time for that. The crew was able to launch one of the life rafts, but the other one was already underwater. The marsh was hit by another big wave that caused most of the people to be swept and thrown into the icy cold water. However, William Smith and Neil McClellan and his 8-month-old baby was able to make it into the life raft. One of Captain Smith's children struggled to swim to the life raft. The child's mother and siblings already dead. The child made it and grabbed the side of the life raft. However, the 2 men on board were weakened by the cold and fatigue, and could not pull the small child on board the boat. It was only a matter of time before the child gave in to the cold and sank beneath the waves. Several hours had passed, and the life raft finally made it to Amherst Island. But by the time it made it to shore, McCullen's baby had died in his arms from the cold. So now only 2 remain out of the 13 people. The people that died were the captain's wife, his children, Greta, John, Harry, Clarence, and another, but we could not find that one's name. Mrs. McCullen, her 8-month-old baby, McClellan's nephew, and deckhand George Cousins. It is a very sad thing when people die at sea, but it is even sadder when the water claims the lives of small children. The cold waters of the Great Lakes and the world's oceans will have no mercy for anyone. I can almost still envision the ship on the surface, riding the storm as the crew frantically scrambled around the ship trying to save the lives of their families. It's a sad thing. Here we have one of the pulleys that was used to hoist up the sail of the ship. What looks like little faces was used to hold the rope down to the ship that connected up into the sails of the ship. Here we have the ship's steering wheel. You can only imagine the poor soul that was trying to pilot the ship through the storm, trying to get everybody on board to safety. As I swim a little bit further, I find a cluster of pots and pans and dishes, probably used to serve the crew members and the children their last meal before the storm. Here we have one of the C-clamps that I found scattered all over the ship that the crew used to try to keep the timbers together throughout the storm. I hope you have enjoyed this tour of the George A. Marsh, and I hope you've learned a little something about the history of the comet and the marsh. It would be great if one day you took the opportunity to go to Kingston and dive in Lake Ontario and visit these wrecks for yourself.